She was being pulled through the heart of town by a wagon rope when the afternoon decided to turn cruel. The line was looped tight around her waist, tight enough to control her, not tight enough to leave her broken. That was the point. This wasn't meant to spill blood, it was meant to spill dignity. Every time the wagon wheels bumped a rut, her boots skidded and her knees dipped, and the street swallowed the scrape of leather and dust like it was normal business. "Somebody please stop." Her voice barely rose above the groan of axles and the grind of iron rims. The words came out thin, not dramatic, more like a person asking the world to remember she was human. And then she said nothing more because she'd already learned what begging bought her in a town where power wore clean coats and everybody else wore silence. Men leaned in doorways, women paused with baskets half lifted. A few children stared until their mothers turned their faces away. And the townsfolk did what fearful crowds always do: they told themselves a story that let them sleep at night. "It's not our quarrel. It's family business. If the merchant is doing this to his own daughter, he must have a reason." The wagon jerked forward again. She stumbled harder this time, boots scraping the hard-packed dirt as the rope bit into her middle. A small sound escaped her throat, something between a gasp and a swallowed sob, and the shame of that sound seemed to hurt more than the drag. That was when her whisper found the wrong set of ears. Or maybe the right ones. Under the blacksmith's awning, a stranger stepped out of shadow into sun. He was a giant of a cowboy, tall enough that his silhouette stole daylight from the boards behind him. Broad shoulders, a frame like a barn door, a hat brim low but not low enough to hide the stillness in his face. He paused mid-stride as if the air itself had grabbed his sleeve. And he murmured, almost like he was talking to the world rather than to anyone in particular. "No woman should ever sound like that." 7 quiet words, no shouting, no theatrics. Yet they landed heavier than a thrown rock, cutting through the crowd deeper than the rope cutting across her waist. He walked forward with the slow, certain pace of a man who didn't rehearse his courage. His shadow fell across her like a shield, and when the driver snapped the reins to keep the horse moving, the stranger's voice rose again, deep, calm, and unbudging. "That's far enough." The horse hesitated. The wagon creaked. The murmuring crowd went still, as if everyone had realized at the same time that something had entered the street that didn't answer to their rules. The woman lifted her head. She expected anger in his eyes, or pity, or that eager hunger people have when they want to be seen doing the right thing. Instead, she found steadiness. An anchor. A look that said, whatever shame they strapped onto you, it doesn't belong to you anymore. "I don't know what they're accusing you of," he said, stepping fully into the horse's path, "but dragging a woman like freight not in front of me." The driver sputtered, "You don't understand, this is. The sheriff, leaning on the boardwalk like it was a slow day, turned his head the other direction as though the sky suddenly required inspection. It didn't matter. The cowboy's presence alone unsettled the street. People shifted their weight, doors creaked a little wider, the ground itself seemed to choose a side. Her knees weakened, not from exhaustion but from the impossible relief of hearing a single voice say what no one else dared. The line meant to break her had met the one man willing to stop it. The driver stiffened, gripping the reins like authority lived in leather. He tried to bark confidence into the air. "Move along," he snapped, "this is town business." His voice wavered the moment the cowboy shifted his stance, not threateningly, just firmly, like the earth trusted him more than the man on the seat. The woman braced herself, expecting shouting, a fist, a gun, a scene that would explode into violence the way fear always threatens to. But the cowboy surprised everyone by keeping his tone level, almost gentle. "Town business shouldn't look like cruelty." That simple sentence sent a ripple through the onlookers. It reminded them of something they'd tried to forget, that wrong can be obvious even when it's popular. Even the sheriff cleared his throat and stepped off the boardwalk, pretending he'd been heading over the whole time. The horse snorted uneasy. The cowboy reached down and placed one big hand over the rope at the woman's waist. He didn't yank. He didn't cut, not yet. He simply stopped its forward pull with quiet certainty, like a man who believed one act of decency could still shift a town's conscience. The woman looked up at him, cheeks flushed with humiliation more than pain, gratitude tangled with confusion as she whispered, "You don't even know me." His answer came low, steady, sharp enough to make several people look away. "I don't need to know you to see this is wrong." The driver opened his mouth to argue again, but his words died when he tried to urge the horse forward and the animal refused, stamping once, as if it too had reached its limit. A few townsfolk murmured that maybe the punishment had been exaggerated, that maybe they'd been too quick to watch and too slow to question. Others shifted as if the rope felt heavier now that someone had named what it really was. The woman straightened slightly, not out of pride, but because his calm defiance lent her a dignity she hadn't felt in days. "They won't listen to me," she said, voice trembling once before shutting itself down again. The cowboy didn't look away. "Then they can listen to me." And for a long, suspended moment, nothing moved, not the horse, not the wagon, not even the dust drifting in the light. Into that hush, the cowboy crouched beside her. Not looming, not touching. Just lowering himself to her level in a gesture so unexpectedly respectful that it exposed the crowd's failure like a lantern in a dark room. He studied the knot with careful fingers, as if the weight of the rope mattered because she mattered. The driver shifted uneasily, suddenly aware of how ugly the scene looked when a stranger treated her like she was made of something rare rather than something disposable. The woman couldn't speak, not with eyes on her from every angle and her heartbeat thudding in her ears. But the cowboy glanced up and gave her the briefest nod, telling her without words, "You don't have to justify anything. You don't have to defend yourself. I'm not stepping aside." He rose and placed himself between her and the wagon just as the sheriff finally approached. "You plan on making trouble, son?" the lawman asked, trying to sound bigger than the moment. The cowboy didn't answer with speeches. He simply shifted his broad frame a step farther forward, enough to say he wasn't there to start trouble. Only to end the kind everyone had tolerated too long. The sheriff's boots thudded on the planks as he tried again to claim the street. "That rope stays until I say otherwise." But the words rang hollow because even the sheriff could hear the uncertainty inside them. The crowd wasn't watching him. They were watching the man in the road who looked like he'd choose mercy over spectacle every time. The driver lifted the reins again, stubborn and frightened. That was when the cowboy spoke, his voice low and firm as river stone. "You pull that horse one more inch, and you answer for what follows." He didn't raise his tone. He didn't need to. The promise threaded through his words was enough to make even the sheriff hesitate. The woman swallowed hard, the strangest question burning behind her ribs. Why would a stranger stand between me and this town's cruelty? "Please," she whispered, barely meaning to, "don't get hurt because of me." The cowboy turned his head just enough for her to see the certainty in his eyes. "Hurt comes from standing aside," he said, "not stepping in." A few townsfolk lowered their gazes like those words had found their throats. The sheriff tried to speak of law, of order, of civic duty. The cowboy finally faced him, not confrontationally, just honestly. "Law doesn't mean dragging a woman down a street to settle personal grudges." The sheriff glanced at the crowd, searching for support that had already moved away from him. The woman felt her knees go weak again when the cowboy placed one hand deliberately on the rope, fingers curling with final resolve. "This ends now." He drew his knife. Not flashing it, not threatening anyone. He lifted it like a man cutting a stubborn fence line. The street narrowed to a single moment, dignity on one side, injustice on the other. The blade touched the rope. A soft snap. The line fell into the dirt, harmless, like it had suddenly realized it didn't belong in the world anymore. The woman felt the sudden absence of pressure around her waist like a breath she'd been holding for days. She swayed, more from relief than weakness, and before she could steady herself, the cowboy slipped an arm beneath her elbow. Not grabbing, not lifting. Just offering balance with the same quiet respect he'd shown from the first step. Whispers rolled through the crowd, shock, relief, shame. The cowboy ignored them all. He guided her into the shade beside the mercantile porch, moving slow, deliberate, refusing to treat her like a problem to be handled or a spectacle to be removed. He knelt, loosened the remaining coil, paused whenever she flinched, and waited for her to breathe again. The sheriff muttered something about sorting this out, but his voice had lost its bite. "I'm all right," she whispered out of habit, because that's what people say when they're afraid the truth will cost them more. The cowboy didn't argue with her pride, he didn't coddle her. "Let's get you out of the sun," he said simply. He fetched a canteen from his saddle and offered it with both hands, letting her take it herself. She drank slowly, breath smoothing as the heat of humiliation began to lift off her shoulders. People drifted away, murmuring that maybe things had gone too far, that maybe they hadn't understood. None of them came closer. Only the cowboy stayed, near enough to protect, far enough to respect. When the street finally emptied into uneasy quiet, he didn't ask for her story. He didn't demand a name. He simply went to his horse, pulled down a spare blanket, and returned to drape it over her shoulders. Gentle, warm, human. And it made her throat tighten, because no one had offered her warmth in days. When she finally pushed herself up, legs trembling, he steadied her at the elbow and waited until she found her own balance, then guided her toward his horse with an unspoken question in his eyes. "Do you trust me enough to leave?" She hesitated only a moment, not because she doubted him, but because she had never been allowed to choose her direction. Then she nodded, small, weak, honest. He helped her into the saddle like she was fragile but not broken, mounted behind her, leaving space, keeping distance, respecting fear while preventing her from falling. The horse started forward at a careful pace. She didn't look back. She couldn't. And the cowboy didn't ask her to. They rode out of the town that had tried to drag her into nothing. Out into open land where nobody shouted, judged, or pulled. Only hooves, only wind. A quiet language between two souls who didn't know each other's names yet, but recognized each other's pain. By the time they reached cottonwoods beside a river, the town was a distant smudge swallowed by dust and memory. He dismounted first, offered his hand only when she hesitated, letting her decide. She accepted with trembling fingers, and when her boots touched the ground, her breath wavered, not from the ride but from the stillness. Because silence meant there was nothing left to distract her from what she'd been carrying alone. He didn't press her. He moved a respectful distance away, leaning against a tree, eyes on the river instead of her face, as if to say, "You're safe enough to speak. Or safe enough not to. Both are fine." That wordless permission broke something loose inside her. "They said I stole from my father," she whispered, voice thin but steadying, "but all I did was refuse to marry the man he chose." She expected disbelief. Instead, the cowboy nodded once, slow, grounded, inviting her to continue. She explained how refusal became defiance, how defiance became accusation, how accusation became a rope and a wagon and a street full of eyes. And with every sentence, it felt like she was setting down stones she'd been forced to carry in silence. When she faltered, staring at her hands, the cowboy spoke softly, low enough to blend with the river. "People punish what they don't understand," he said, "doesn't make them right. No lecture. No sermon. Just truth." It made her eyes burn because it was the first thing anyone had said that didn't twist her story into something convenient. They had barely begun following the riverbank toward the next settlement when distant hoofbeats cracked through the quiet like warning thunder. Her body stiffened, fingers clenched the blanket as if afraid the rope would return. The cowboy shifted, calm, prepared, placing himself slightly ahead of her without even thinking about it. 3 riders came in.